You brought out the nuances of history, culture, and the text so well. And one of the participant, her name is Para Tiwari from Madhya Pradesh. She asked the question that how we can interpret A Tale of Two Cities and Animal Farm from the new historicism point of view to the students.
If we are teaching Dickens's novel, then you will have to introduce to them any other writings about that period. There could be letters, there could be diaries, there could be accounts by eyewitnesses. You can't give everything to the students, but the students should know that Dickens was putting it in the form of a novel. But what happened during the French Revolution, it has been expressed in several ways. And as a student of the new historicism, one should learn to put the novel, which is the literary expression, as well as the other documents that we have, and see how they interact with one another and negotiate with one another. That's one thing we can do as an experiment. And the other method would be to see what the effect of Dickens's novel was on the perception of the French Revolution. We are not talking about the authenticity of his presentation. What effect did this novel have on the perception of the French Revolution? You know, there was a very conservative reaction to the French Revolution by the British generally, and British politics wanted to take care of the fact that such revolutionary ideas, they don't infiltrate into the British society. So that's how you would be looking at just at how the material is presented by Dickens, but what kind of a discourse of the French Revolution does he create? Does he give a very dark and negative portrayal of one phase of the revolution without mentioning the other values for which it began? That I think is one way we can introduce our students to the methodology of the new historicism.
Okay. And my question to you, sir, you have mentioned about Greenblatt's theory about he talks about the fairy queen and where the knights represent the style and that period of whatever their culture, their tradition, and how Barth will would look at it, because Barth says that no history or culture, only the text.
No,
So.
no. If we are looking at the text, Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, from the new historicist point of view, we have very good insights given not only by Greenblatt, but also the practitioners of cultural materialism in England. Um, the whole argument which I tried to bring into my presentation was that we should not read The Fairy Queen as an incomplete epic poem and talk only about how it imitated the Italian models which were there earlier of the long narratives, if not an epic poem. Um, and then it also doesn't help much to say that the entire work as it is now available is about chivalry, and therefore the adventures of the knights are shown. What is much more important was that that was a period of great turmoil. Queen Elizabeth had a very tough time because though it was a monarchy, it was not a very powerful monarchy. There were lords who were almost independent, and they had their own private armies also. So the only way Queen Elizabeth could have maintained order and prevented anarchy was to symbolically establish herself as a very, very distinguished person, one who may be only a queen born in a royal family, but who has other greater attributes also. And in this process, many things happened. Panegyrics were written, praise poems were written, and one such part of that whole process of, in a way, deifying her and making her a symbol of order in society is Edmund Spenser's fairy queen. And that's how we should look at it. As you say, not Barthes, but others who may not believe in this relationship between history and a literary text may not agree. But I have the feeling that if we read Greenblatt's interpretation, and also by the practitioners of cultural materialism, I think we would agree, because why did such a text emerge at that particular period?
That's
What
what,
was
sir.
its
When we teach Wordsworth,
Mm.
we should know about the Romantic period. We should know the French Revolution. The students should know you how to say, introduce that, and then bring the poem. Then the students will understand in what circumstances the poets write such beautiful poems. Without that, it is only to the text means the interpretation would be entirely different. The meaning would be different. I feel that new historians, whoever has brought this theory, is something worth. Maybe I belong to the old tradition. People may not agree with me, but I feel that new historians, whatever their ideas regarding the relationship between the text and the culture and the history, is something worth which the students
Yes,
should know.
certainly, because now we have exhausted the old way of reading literary texts from the new critical point of view, where you talk about structure, images, symbols, etc. There are two questions which we should be asking. One is, what do I understand about that entire society if I take this as one of the texts, not the only text, but the poems of Wordsworth can constitute a set of texts. And in order to understand that relationship, I should know many things. For example, Wordsworth's own involvement in the French Revolution, in the sense he was called back by his parents, and he began as a supporter of those values, and then he became a conservative. What was the political atmosphere in England at that time, and what were, for example, the earlier attitudes of the entire Romantic period movement of that time towards industrialization, towards the inequality it was bringing, and the disruptions that it was bringing. Because we can't, as the new historians say, focus only on genius called words. We'll have to tell our students that, see, Wordsworth is one among the many participants who were trying to respond to the earlier revolution and also look at their society.
Subhash?
Yes, sir. So can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay. There are several questions which have come from the YouTube stream from the participants. Okay, I will begin with this question from Miss Aparna Srinivasa. She asks, "What is the relationship between New Historicism and culture studies?"
I did not mention cultural materialism because I did not want to divert from my focus on the new historicism. Actually, the genealogy is of this kind. It all begins with Raymond Williams and his wonderful books on the study of culture and society, the Long Revolution, and many more. It is these books which reformulated the idea of culture as a material practice, as something which is embedded in the political, the social, the linguistic, and all kinds of contexts. He was the one who actually initiated a very fresh way of analyzing culture. And because of his argument that all practices, including artistic practices, poetic and dramatic practices, they are all, first of all, embedded in social ambience, one. Secondly, they also participate in it. Because of these arguments, the nomenclature given was cultural materialism, where you look at culture as a set of very concrete material practices within a real society. And cultural materialism um, it influenced Stephen Greenblatt, who was a student here. He had come on a fellowship, and then he developed it into the new historicism. Though, of course, many times he used another label also. He called it cultural poetics. In many places, Greenblatt doesn't use the term the new historicism. And the next thing to evolve out of these developments was cultural studies. That's the genealogy. Raymond Williams, and then cultural materialism, and the new historicism in USA, and then cultural studies at Birmingham School, and then it becomes a global phenomenon. What's important is cultural materialism and the new historicism have a vast shared field. In fact, there are many commentators who say that these are two names we give to the same kind of stance and approach. Though there are some basically political differences, I would say, between the new historicism practiced by scholars in the US, and then cultural materialism, which is being practiced now also uh, from the pro-left scholars in UK.
Okay. There's a question from Abriti Sanyal. She asks, as a teacher, I often struggle with how to teach history of literature to students without simply turning it into a linear periodization of events and writers. Could you kindly speak on this?
Yes. I mentioned in my presentation that the new historicism does not accept these kinds of linear narratives, narratives of either progress or moving from one period to another. So there are philosophical and theoretical positions. We shall not go into that. Our immediate question is, how do we teach literary history? What should we do, if at all we are trying to take advantage from the writings of the new historicists? I would suggest that we could learn from one of their practices. And what they do is, instead of making very abstract comments about what was the Romantic period, what was the Victorian period, we could draw their attention to some of the texts which are available to us. See, let me give one example. For example, if I have to teach the heart of darkness, then one of the methods suggested by the new historicists is to tell our students that see what was happening in Congo at that time, and how is it that King Leopold of Belgium, he owned and he took over that vast stretch of land because he wanted ivory, and how this was a part of the discussion which was going on there. And then comes Joseph Conrad, and not only he, but there are many others also who had gone there. And the issues that we find in the novel are the very negative way in which not only the exploiting class of imperialists is shown through Mr. Goods, but also the very marginalized way, and again a very negative way in which the Africans themselves are shown in the novel. We remember Achibi had very serious problems with the representation of the Congo people, the African people here. Now, if we can start with such anecdotes and such information, maybe one, it can appeal to the students. Secondly, instead of just telling them a very diachronic story about what happened in this year, what happened later, we could give them the feel of the real. I'm using the term used by Greenblatt. It says we should have this feel of the real. So that can be done if we are able to collect uh, the cultural texts of the period we want to teach, and gradually, inform the students about them. That's how one could do it. Or another thing would be, if we want to avoid simple chronology, we could think about the major discourses. What are these writers and others, artists, and then politicians, common people of that period, what are they talking mostly about? Why are certain things so important to them that they write plays, they watch plays, they write in their diaries? So I think we can make a list, as we say, a matrix or list of those things and draw attention of the students. So that's one way of not falling into the old track of a linear periodization of literary history.
Okay, sir. Dr. Lucy James says, thank you for your erudite talk on new historicism. You mentioned continuous intertextuality. How does this apply to religious texts? Kindly explain.
I didn't get the drift of the question. I am interpreting it in this way. I was talking about a continuous intertextuality in the sense the text may belong to various areas. It could be a religious text, it could be a theological text, it could be some kind of a decision taken by the ruling class at that time. We treat, as far as the new historicism is considered, all of them as texts and cultural texts. What happens is from one so-called cultural text belonging to, say, religion, things are always passing down and passing into the other texts. There is that kind of an intertextuality. In the presentation I mentioned the essay Invisible Bullets, where you have these texts, religious texts, because Christopher Marlowe had made a comment which could have been taken as a very blasphemous statement from a religious point of view, saying that Moses from the Old Testament was only a juggler. But what we discover when we read the essay is that so many things were happening in religion. Yes, there were discussions going on. There was some kind of a rationalist critique also, but then there were extreme forms of atheism, and these passed on to the public debate, and that led to laws being passed, and that again led to exile and execution also of those who were extreme non-believers, or they said blasphemous things against religion. And I'm sure in religion also there is a huge amount of intertextuality. The problem of a single religious text is related to other historical development. You canonize a particular tradition of the text. Look into any religion, there is nothing like one text. There is a whole tradition of text. But what happens is at some point of time, for political, for other reasons, for institutional relations, certain elements are canonized as the true part of religion. And that is where the intertextuality is forcibly stopped, because we're saying, no, no, this is now a pure theological or a religious text, and this we are going to honor. But in reality, we find that religious texts, they keep moving around, circulating in society. They are given various interpretations by various classes of people. That's what I would say about intertextuality of religion.
Okay, sir. The next question is from Ambika Kamath. Do you see any discourses that coexist on global level in the realm of politics or environment or health emergencies that could be interpreted with the help of new historicism?
An excellent question. I think it is happening now. On the one hand, uh, we had come to a certain level of complacency across the globe, that the technology we have and the science we have is more than adequate, and it will give us protection. And these are strictly speaking not scientific scientific. They are myths which are created in the public domain on the basis of science. And now that the virus has shocked us into rethinking about all these, discourses are now emerging. One very important discourse is, um, because we're students of literature, I'm mentioning it. How is literature going to deal with this? Amitav Ghosh had said that unfortunately, in serious modern literature, we don't have much about the ecological disasters like the pandemic, etc. We don't have. It's all being done only in science fiction and in certain genres of popular fiction, etc., but not in serious literature. Uh, but recently, after the this pandemic started, he gave an interview, and in the interview, he said that from now onwards, there are going to be more and more literary texts about this. So, one is that the literary discourse it is itself now enlarging itself, and now it is perhaps taking up the question of the ecological disasters also and how to represent them. How is it going to be represented? On the other hand, once again, I'm taking his argument further. He had correctly said that there is a problem with this anthropocentric thinking. Man is the center. The universe is only made for man. This anthropocentric thinking, which is there in all our discourses, in religion and in our modern science and maybe in our literature also, this is guilty of creating a worldview which can lead to the disasters that we are seeing. Because though I don't think we really have any conclusive sort of arguments, there is definitely a relationship between the degradation of the environment and pandemic that we are now facing. So I'm sure the one, I mean, one doesn't feel like saying it, but the virus has also been instrumental in globalizing us, making us rethink about community, about science, about our ethical responsibilities. But if it's a question of coexisting of different discourses, the other kind of discourses are also persisting. So you can use authoritarian power to get rid of it, and then maybe you want us to beyond the pandemic. I'm sure these are some of the elements which are now emerging before us
Okay, sir.
as the discourses are
Vishaka
concerned.
Devi, she asks, how would we as readers read texts of Kushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan and Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, for instance, from the perspective of New Historicism? If New Historicism is to read texts, understand, interpret, which would make them perforated with too many cultural interpretations. Please throw some light on this.
Okay, I think there are two parts to the question. The first one is if you are handling a text like Train to Pakistan or Midnight's Children, how would we do it, from the new historicist point of view? Once again, maybe I'm repeating some of the things I said earlier. What we need to do before we can start a proper understanding or interpretation of these two texts is to look at the discourses which go into it, because it is a particular kind of interpretation of the partition, the first one, Kushwant Singh's novel. And it is itself a product of the whole churning of perceptions and ideas. For example, one is that the rural life and village life was organic before it was shattered by the event of the partition. And there was probably no communal strife before it was sharpened by the partition rights. These were some of the discourses which are also there on the margins of the text. And then there is throughout that novel, you find that the whole onus of solving the crisis, it falls on the protagonist, and it is being suggested by the author who uses all the patterns, etc., of popular fiction. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying it pejoratively. Is using all of them. So the whole onus is now on the individual, and the individual who is instinctively secular, and therefore you would like to stop at least the violence emerging out of communalism. So these are things which are not there only in Kushwan Singh's novel. They were all around. You have now you have letters, you have diaries, you have newspaper clippings, and you have enough material to show that this was the product. It doesn't matter whether it was written later, but the experience that goes into the novel was product of this period in which there was so much of a churning on what is religion, what is a society, what is a community, where are our loyalties. That's how I think the new historicism would want us to read, not as a document of the partition. No. It is creating a discourse. It is creating a discourse, and the discourse is that if you are a good human being, like Jagat, well, you can negotiate with even such a huge crisis. Is that acceptable? How do we analyze such a discourse? That's the way in which I think the new historicism take up that particular novel. And the other part of the question, I think, is if we are going to perforate the text with all these. I know the first impression we always get about the new historicism is that you bring in too many things and you make the text so porous, anything can go in, anything can go out. No, no, no. Really speaking, again, I quote Greenblatt. He has said again and again that there is no returning to the formalist reading of a literary text. We may not go back to the idea of a closed text, but at the same time, it does not mean that you're reducing the literary text to the so-called historical. No. You are paying attention to it. For example, if I have to interpret Midnight's Children, naturally, I would first start with the idea of carnivalesque and try to understand why carnivalizing and the carnivalesque model, they are both related to a kind of interrogation of the power. The very idea of carnivalizing, which Rushdie uses about the modern post-independence history of India, is done in the low mimetic style. It is done in the carnivalesque style. And we have to look into that because the carnivalesque is basically a questioning of the dominant discourses. It's a questioning of history itself being treated, as so many public events with charismatic leaders, whereas the novel, in a way, it dismantles all this and says that, see, here are very vulnerable, uh, ordinary human beings, and this is what happens to them. That I think is what one could do with a text of that kind.
Okay, sir. Kusuma M asks a question. Will there be a clash between liberalist and new historicism theoretical tendencies while interpreting the text?
Literalist, I didn't get
Liberalists. The
liberal.
liberalist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, um, Question was whether there would be a clash between the liberalist and the new
New
historicist.
historicists. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, this can happen at not really at the level of interpretation, because interpretations will go on varying even within these two so-called camps, liberalism, new historicism. But I think the conflict could happen at the theoretical level. In the sense, many of the arguments of the new historicism, they question the liberal humanist tradition, um, including the belief in progress, the belief in the continuous civilizational improvement in history, and then the belief that one can arrive at definite objective truth. There are many things which are part of the liberalist tradition, and all these are these are and particularly there has been, if not conflict, a lot of discussion and debate on this particular area. The new historicism seems to suggest that power is so powerful, if you don't find it a paradox, power is so powerful that it supports rebellion and subversion and then contains it. It finds uses even for opposition and subversion. Now, the question raised by critics who are more sympathetic to the liberal tradition is, are you not seeing any space at all for a real subversion? Does it mean that it's always a win-win situation for power, that even rebellion will only serve the purpose of power? I am sure many historians do not agree, not just the Marxists, but there are many who do not agree. Personally, also, despite all the very nuanced explanations given by the practitioners of the new historicism, somewhere the doubt lingers in the mind that this could not be, though it is from Foucault, this could not be the only way one can think about history.
Okay. Uh, the last question.
Yes.
Why do the new historicists not believe in the diachronic approach to history? For example, a historical overview of Renaissance would help in understanding how Shakespeare produced his plays, either following or rejecting the ideas of humanism. Does the synchronic approach, focusing on little narratives of a particular period, fail to see the advantage of a diachronic approach that encompasses a larger picture? Asks Annapurni Sethu.
Correct. Again, a very good question. Um, the whole issue is about how we interpret this diachronic. Unfortunately, the diachronic way of looking at history uh, also brings the other baggage with it. When you start talking about the point of origin, and then you assume that there are very causal relationships between one and the other in terms of time, and that the one leads to the other almost automatically. For example, there are many such literary histories of Renaissance drama where you start with the medieval morality play, and then you talk about the influence of the Greek, and more than Greek, the Latin writers, and then the evolution of the comedy, and then how this led to early Elizabethan dramatists, and then how it led to Shakespeare. The disagreement on the part of the new historicists is with this clean kind of narrative you are constructing, and that one necessarily leads to the other. It's not that they don't see history as starting in a vacuum. They don't. They are very clearly aware that even when you are focusing on one particular chunk or period, there are things. There's nothing like a terminus here and the terminus there at the end. They are aware of that. But then why do they insist on the synchronic? Because the synchronic, uh, instead of talking about the influence of the one on the one for example, drama reflecting the social reality, you would be able to see that they all of them constitute a field, and there is a dynamic interaction going on all the time. It's there all the time, and this perspective should not rule out the diachronic, but the question is of the emphasis, the question is of the perspective. The new historicist perspective is synchronic in this sense that rather than saying that this happened first and then it came to literature, it's better to correctly understand that these were happening simultaneously, and naturally the one flowed into the other. That I think is what is meant by saying that the synchronic is closer to the exploration made by the new historicists.
Sir, one question.
Yes, please.
Uh, how do you look at the narratives of COVID-19 from your point of view or from the new historical point of view?
Too early, it's early days to talk about the new historicist perspective because we are in the middle of it and we are witnesses and we are also participants. But what's very, very interesting is that it has triggered off um, our examination, interrogation of many of the discourses, political, economic, cultural, etc., on the media of them, they have given rise to a very serious questioning of the models that we have been using so far. GDP, and then wealth creation, and then the benefits of globalization. You suddenly see that there is such huge inequality, and you start wondering who built this economy, who are the ones, who are the real ones who built the economy. So that kind of a discourse now it is in this fluid situation where you have so much, there is activism, there is every effort to ameliorate or improve the situation for those who are suffering from it. But there is also questioning, there is also interrogation that's happening in the economic field and also in the political discourses. And I mentioned earlier in answer to another question, even in respect of our attitude to the environment around us, and shouldn't we be reviewing it completely, totally? That's also happening here. So I feel that um, the COVID situation. Then let me mention just two small things before I finish. Um, uh, Look at the debates on will this help us to go back to a communitarian, not communal, communitarian approach to politics in society, where we stop thinking very individually and talk only about why us, why did the virus have to come now when we are citizens.
Mm.
Instead of that, would it be possible for us to think as a community? Because now we see how hopelessly we are bound to each other. There's no
Yes.
way you can break those things. So maybe if all these things which are now being widely circulated, images, ideas, rethinkings, and then very soon they will be coming through our expressive cultural forums also. Maybe all of them would add up, and then we would be able to have a new historicist perspective on COVID, and hopefully, COVID should give us time, leisure, and the energy to do it.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you, sir. So wonderful question answer session. And I hope the participants are satisfied with your answers. And I request Sarika, please propose the vote of thanks.
I will I would like to thank the host institution and all of you at the department, and most importantly, those who listen to me and ask such wonderful questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I thank all the participants. And we had tough time for the past 2 days with our connectivity, and we were shifting from WebEx to YouTube. And Subhash, hats off to you. You have made it. Today, finally, we have achieved it. So I hope the participants had enjoyed today's talk. And I thank all of you. Yeah, have a nice evening and be safe and have physical distancing. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.